All right, well, our thank you to Francesca for setting up our discussion with her overview of sort of what's currently going on in the state of the space environment. And I think that's important because unlike yesterday's panel, today we are squarely focused on the problems of now. And we're not going to be dilly-dallying around with these visions and dreams of what could happen in the future. We have to deal with the problems and challenges of today, and that's what she was talking about. And our focus is how can we deal with some of these particular challenges. As we, it was hinted at, and you've seen sort of in the media news reports, there's a lot of change innovation happening in the commercial space world. The two primary drivers, the rise of small satellites and the return of very large constellations. And no, I'm not going to use mega in front of a technical audience because I know that's not actually millions, right? These two, there are commercial companies that are leveraging these technologies to develop what could be really amazing new capabilities for Earth remote sensing, for communications that could really change the world. The question is, or the challenge is that a lot of the existing licensing frameworks are not set up to deal with these new endeavors, either because the scale just wasn't really imagined, or because these companies are doing things that fall outside of what the governments had set in place as like boxes for licensing. And so there are also serious concerns as the number of objects grow, and you saw the growth chart that Francesca outlined. What does that mean for the future orbital debris environment? What does that mean for a conjunction assessment, collision avoidance, and just the overall long-term sustainability of space? So that's the question we're going to try and grapple with this morning, is what are the steps that satellite operators, that government licensors, insurers, and other stakeholders can take to mitigate these challenges while still allowing for the innovation and the new services to develop. So today I've got a variety of excellent people to help me out with this. I'm going to introduce them, not necessarily in the order they're sitting, but in the order that they're going to be giving their opening remarks, and then we're going to shift to questions and answers. I have some questions that I'm going to be going off of, but please, as you did yesterday morning, please submit any questions you have through the SIFT app, which the link should be up on the board in a second, and we'll get to those towards the end. So, sitting immediately on my right is Ms. and hopefully soon Dr. Agnieszka Lukaszczyk.
No pressure.
No pressure. She's the Senior Director for European Affairs at Planet. And prior to that, she worked at the European Commission on both their Copernicus remote sensing program and their SSA programs. And then prior to that, I was pleased to say she's a colleague of mine at Secure World Foundation. Sitting next to her is Dr. David Goldstein. He's the Director of Special Projects at SpaceX, where he oversees and manages all aspects of their NASA Launch Services program and other government agency missions and studies. He's a retired Air Force colonel after a career focused on systems engineering, R&D, and launch operations. Next to me on my left is Dr. Mike Nichols. He's the co-founder and chief technology officer of Leo Labs, one of the startup companies looking to develop commercial SSA, particularly for radars. Prior to co-founding Leo Labs, Mike was a program manager at SRI International, where he developed and operated large aperture phased array radars for scientific studies. On the end is Mr. Chris Kunstadter. He's the global head of space at AXA XL, a leading provider of space insurance. Chris is very actively involved, and those of us who've seen Chris, who've seen pop up all these kinds of different meetings, and all different kinds of their space activity, including technical, financial, actuarial, policy, claims, industry, pretty much an all-around kind of guy on space insurance. Chris also serves on several industry and government advisory bodies. And finally, but definitely not least, Dr. Diane Howard. She's the Chief Counsel for Space Commerce at the U.S. Department of Commerce. In addition to providing space law expertise at the Office of Space Commerce and the Department of Commerce as a whole, she also participates in interagency work and is actively involved in the implementation of the Trump administration's Space Policy Directive 3 on space traffic management. Diane's had a long career working on space law issues, both domestically and internationally, and has also designed and taught multidisciplinary space courses at both Embry-Riddle and the University of Texas at Austin. So I'm going to ask each of them to kind of provide opening remarks, and then we'll move into the Q&A. So Agnieszka, I was wondering if you could start talking about Planet's perspective on these issues, and so what have you learned from your operations experience?
Sure. Thank you very much for having me and for inviting me. I really appreciate it. I am also a little bit intimidated being on the panel with pretty much PhDs. I did turn in my dissertation already, so it's really a matter of time. I'll be back with the right title next time, hopefully. And I also appreciate that Secure World, which Secure World often does that, actually keeps the gender balance at their panels, which at space conferences, especially space security conferences, it's a rare thing. So folks, next time you organize a conference, please keep that in mind. Let ladies speak up from time to time. But being a part of Planet, it's been a journey. I actually came from a public sector to Planet. So, and joining a company that actually runs a mega constellation, although we're nothing compared to this guy over here, but we have launched a lot of satellites, and a lot of people were very skeptical about this. A lot of people have been watching us, first of all, just to even see if we have a viable business model, if we're going to survive, but also if we're going to create a lot of mess up there. A lot of voices have been saying that CubeSats really are another form of space debris. And this is something that we've been very conscious of. So Planet, I don't know how much you know about Planet, but we have launched over 300 satellites to date. And we operate now about 170 satellites, 160, which allows us to monitor every place on Earth every day. We are very conscious of sustainability in general, of sustainability on Earth. This is why we have the assets that we have in space to actually have a positive impact on planet Earth, but also of sustainability of the outer space activities. And we do not take those lightly. And we really wanted to position ourselves as a responsible space actor so that others that will come after us will be able to perhaps learn from our decisions. Some of them were good, some of them were not good, but to sort of set up some sort of standard out there. Why are we doing that? Because we do not feel that there are enough standards, norms, and best practices out there, and we have to kind of figure things out as we go. So our satellites, most of our satellites are are in sun-synchronous orbit in about 500 kilometers altitude. And they're small, they're 3U, which means that with time, due to atmospheric drag, they eventually burn in atmosphere. So we do not leave any trace there. We do not leave any sort of debris. The lifespan of those satellites is about 3 years or so. We are participating in various initiatives here, domestic but also international, where space safety and space security issues are being discussed and norms are being kind of put in place. We are sharing our data completely transparently on our website, by the way, but we also work closely with CSPOC and Space Data Association, and therefore other operators. We have just signed on to the recently announced Space Safety Coalition, because we do believe that we need to build together this ecosystem of responsible space actors, because it is in our interest. It's I saw with the keynote earlier, there was a question of transparency, how transparent operators would like to be. At Planet, we believe that transparency is everything, really. You cannot really hide in space. If you have a pretty good amateur telescope and you know where to look, you can pretty much see everything. So it's just, I think transparency is the key. We don't need to know what your satellite is doing. We just need to know that it's there. So this is kind of our stand on it, and I will be happy to answer questions one day.
Great.
All right?
Thank you. Appreciate it. So, to you, for SpaceX perspective on this.
Okay, thank you. So it's a great honor to be here. In my view, this is the best conference run in the entire world. So Sandy, I expect my coffee or something later for that. SpaceX is new to sort of large constellations, but we've been launching rockets and launching satellites into space and operating our Dragon capsule in space for quite some time. I'm relatively new to this area, so to prep, I've been talking to my son a lot. He's 17 and very much into politics, so we've been having a lot of debates recently, and so gun control and border protection have been the things we've been talking about that are quite lively at home. And so I wanted to ask all of you. I'm not going to ask you about any of those things, but how many of you either personally work or work at a company, or you care deeply about space debris and collision avoidance in space? So raise your hand. Okay, so barely any of you, so that's good.
This is the place for that.
Yeah, exactly. Unlike gun control and border protection, those are sort of polarizing, and there's not a lot of commonality between some of the views. In this world of sustainability for space, I think we all agree, we all really want the same thing. I think every single one of us in this room want the same thing, and I actually stole the space sustainability definition with one little tweak from the Secure World Foundation site. The ability of all humanity to continue to use outer space for peaceful purposes and to secure peace, I added, and socio and economic benefit for all time, right? That's the definition. I think we all agree that that's what we want, and so we need to work together to do that. So we're going to show you a quick video, because I have to show video because I'm from SpaceX, and then I'm going to tell you a little bit about Starlink and just some of the things that we're doing to increase sustainability. So go ahead with the video. So we've been working on Starlink for about 4 years now. We're moving from the development to deployment. We had 2 launches of satellites back in February of 2018, and then we launched 60 satellites back in May of this last year. And we're expecting 2 to 4 more launches this year, and then another up to 24 in the next 12 months. We've learned a lot from some of those who have struggled with large constellations. You say mega constellations. You know, the correct term would be kiloconstellations, but I don't think we want to say kiloconstellations. I don't think that's going to work very well. It doesn't flow. But you know, on the spacecraft side, to build a big constellation like this, you really need to be able to mass manufacture these. You know, fortunately, we have a CEO who's really good at mass manufacturing amazing Tesla cars, and so that helps us a lot. And then, you know, we're pioneering reusability on launch vehicle side to keep the cost down. And to be able to turn these launches very quickly will be very important. And we also have the ability to be able to optimize the satellite and the launch vehicle system, which I don't think anybody else has ever been able to do, which is a unique ability that we have. And so you know, we're working to launch over this time into 72 planes, 20 satellites each, and this is in our last filing. This is as if the FCC approves our update to the filing. We didn't increase the number of satellites there, but did change the number of planes. We are pushing for continuous broadband across the whole globe, and so obviously to do that, we need a lot of satellites. We also want to fly low, because we believe that flying lower is gonna aid in the sustainability in space, and I'll talk about that in a minute. We recognize that there's a lot of with this there's great responsibility having a large constellation, and so we are committed as well to being highly transparent and really working with all other owner operators and with the many organizations that are out there to ensure that. And so to do that, we're flying at the current constellation at 550 kilometers. The decay time for a natural decay without any propulsion would be about 5 years there, and of course much faster with active. We're also designing our satellites to be fully demisable, and so this current design is fully demisable in reentry. And so for on-orbit maneuverability, we have Krypton thrusters on our satellites, and that has a dual benefit of keeping us safe from supervillains from the planet Krypton, and so very effective at that, I'm sure. Let's see. In terms of data sharing, the data sharing piece is very important to us, and we've been working with the 18th Space Control Squadron, the CSPOC, to publish our precise ephemerides that we generate and the covariance. We're now publishing on the SpaceTrack website, along with a few other very forward-thinking companies. No, a couple other companies are now doing that as well, and we believe that's very important. We're also sharing our burn predictions in those ephemerides, which we think is important because clearly the CSPOC only publishes the Keplerian propagation. In terms of collision avoidance, so no one asked me the question about collision avoidance and the interaction with ESA. It obviously is very important for us. One of the mottos that we have at SpaceX is we like to fail fast, And so in this case, we got this bug worked out in our software, and we got past that. Fortunately, we learned a lot from that. We agree with ESA's conclusions that it's very difficult to be able to do this on an individual email sort of basis. The personal relationships are super important, but we have to figure out some automated ways to do that. And so to conclude, because I know we're getting antsy, I wrote in my notes pithy quote, so I'm going to give you my pithy quote at the end here. Space operations is a team sport, and we completely understand this. It requires responsible players in there. And also, I would ask for a lot of very fact-based media coverage. That also helps a lot. But we really all want the same thing. We want space sustainability. We're committed to that, to be transparent, to be smart, to be safe, and we're going to shoulder our responsibility in doing that because we are completely committed. We're going to launch a whole bunch of people's satellites. We're going to launch cargo and astronauts up to the International Space Station. Very soon we're going to be launching astronauts. We also want to launch to the moon and Mars and beyond. And so all of this is very important to us, and we're committed to being a good teammates in this with all of you. So thank you.
One of the great challenges of my life is getting reporters to use the word close approach instead of collision, right? Because we have no idea if they actually would have collided or not. We just know they came close. That's basically all we can do. So, Mike, I'm going to turn to you as a company trying to provide better SSA data to help solve some of these challenges. What's your perspective on these issues?
Yeah, so thanks very much for the opportunity to be on this panel and tell everybody a little bit about what we're doing at Leo Labs to provide space situational awareness services to satellite operators, to regulators, and to other parts of the government. So we heard this morning about this generational change happening in low Earth orbit where tens of thousands of new satellites are being put into space and really representing an emerging set of capabilities from a wide variety of actors, not just a few that we hear about most in the media. And with these changes comes a need for new frameworks, new capabilities, and new services to enable the commercialization of space while ensuring that appropriate rules and regulations are in place to minimize the creation of space debris and to promote responsible behavior. So at Leo Labs, we founded the company about 3 years ago now, and our goal is to provide services and transparency that we think that the emerging marketplace needs. So our primary goal is to track everything in low Earth orbit that can lead to a catastrophic collision, a collision that generates a significant amount of new space debris. And in doing so, to shine a light on risks that operators and regulators face, but that they have been blind to, either because the technology and the data hasn't been available or because the operations aren't transparent. We're doing this by applying a new business model to SSA. So we're selling services, not infrastructure. We're known for our phased array radars, but we're not selling radars, we're selling services. And we're promoting a platform mentality where users, customers, operators, regulators, they can connect to us via open APIs and connect to us in a way that makes sense for their needs and build applications on top of our data feeds. We're trying to quickly learn and adjust and adapt to the market by talking to our customers. And we're trying to build useful tools built on our large proprietary data streams that are streaming into our cloud and where we attach data services on to provide new capabilities to the marketplace. And finally, a key tenet at our company is to serve every player in the LEO market, from the small satellite up to the mega constellation and the megasat. I'll use those terms. And so, for example, we recently released a product called LEO Track at the SmallSat conference that's dedicated to tracking of small satellites and services they need. So how are we accomplishing this? If you could bring up that slide, please. The primary thing is that we're building out the first commercially owned and operated radar network dedicated to the tracking of space debris, in particular small space debris. Could you bring up the slide, please? We're working closely with satellite operators to understand the operational tools they need for collision avoidance services, whether that's real-time conjunction screening tools or whether it's better tools to interface with each other in these operational scenarios. So we're working towards assessing and monitoring aggregate and dynamic risks. So for example, on this slide, one thing you can see is our today's conjunctions tool, which we released earlier this year, and you can go to our booth and see it in real time, and it's showing all of the close approaches, or riskiest close approaches happening today. And the idea is to show everything that's happening in LEO, not just the things that affect active satellites, because while these things may not be a risk to a particular satellite operator, or perhaps even to any satellite operator, they're a risk to the environment, and they're things we should know about before we start putting more objects into space. And finally, we're providing tools to regulators. And one example of that is a platform we announced earlier this year with the New Zealand Space Agency called the Regulatory and Sustainability Platform, and a snapshot is shown there. And the goal there is to give the NZSA the tools they need to monitor the satellites launched from New Zealand that they are ultimately responsible for, and allow them to set compliance limits and monitor the compliance of those satellites, and as compared to the licenses and regulations in place in New Zealand. So in closing, just a couple of comments. We believe that without this next generation of tracking services and tracking tools, the next major collision is going to be a surprise for everyone, and the response will be chaotic, and it will put business models at jeopardy and reputations at risk. So we really want to get out in front of that and not make the next collision a surprise. And finally, we're seeing that the rules of the road are being built by those who take action, and we're seeing that both on the operator side, who are getting ahead of the regulations by putting out best practices, and we're seeing that from regulators themselves as they go out there and put in compliance tools that they need to effectively manage the fleet of constellations that they're responsible for. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So, Chris, as someone who works in the insurance industry, and how do you see all this stuff shaping up, and what's the role you guys can play?
So I'm Chris Constellations, Global Head of Space for AXA XL, an insurance company. I'm based in New York. I've been in the space insurance business for 35 years. So what is space insurance? That means when a rocket blows up or a satellite up in space fails, we write a big check. So we provide a financial safety net for satellite operators, manufacturers, launch providers, anybody who operates in the space domain. And we embrace risk. I mean, we're an insurance company. We embrace risk. So we take all of the technical risk from launch onwards through the life of a satellite. We cover every type of event, including collision. We exclude a few things like war and terrorism, but everything else is covered under our policies. In fact, we're the lead insurer for Planet, and we do a lot of insurance with SpaceX also, so we're very proud of that. Our process involves identifying risks, assessing them, and treating them by transferring risk from the satellite owner, for example, to us. In return for the premium, we take the risk. And it's an international business. There was recently an Italian-built launch vehicle carrying a French-built satellite for a customer in the United Arab Emirates. The launch vehicle failed. The largest space insurance loss ever, $415 million. As well as a Chinese satellite that was launched on a Long March launch vehicle that failed right after separation from the launch vehicle, $250 million. So in those two losses, plus a smaller one this year, we've already seen $700 million of losses. And we expect to take in the market expects to take in about $450 million of premium. So we know already it's going to be a losing year. But we're in a unique position because we can use our insurance to incentivize good behavior. So we, as many of you have heard me say, whenever I get a microphone in my hand, I will mention beacons. We believe every satellite should have a beacon on it. Now, a beacon with the size of a Post-it note with a solar cell and a transmitter, transmitting a unique identifier, which would help the chart that Francesca showed in her keynote of compliance with identification of satellites, especially from launches of large numbers of satellites. We are big fans of beacons, and I will never stop saying that, until everyone has a beacon. Now, we know there won't be 100% compliance. We recognize that. It's not something we expect everyone to comply with. But if we can increase those numbers, then maybe we can get people to do more than the minimum they're required to do, and maybe move up the ladder on that space sustainability rating that Francisca showed in her presentation. So we also are advocates for propulsion for satellites, especially above the ISS, or at least above, say, 600 kilometers. We think that that's very important. So insurance is it's an enabler of innovation, and it's an enabler of investment. Without insurance, the commercial space market probably wouldn't exist in the form it is today. So we're very proud to be part of the business, and we believe that we have a very big role to play in incentivizing good behavior. Thank you.
Excellent. And so, Diane, turning to you as somebody who works for a government agency that is thinking about, how do we license some of these activities? Can you talk a little bit about your perspective on these issues?
Yes, and I would like to first of all thank you very much for inviting me. I'm a newbie. I'm one first-year AMOS people, so I've really enjoyed being here. It's amazing to see so many people like-minded and caring about these issues. And I would posit to you that not only are space operations a team sport, so too are governing space operations. So I'm going to tell you a little bit about what we do at the Office of Space Commerce, but really what I'm talking about is process, and that process is not specific to us. It's across, I don't think it's only in the US that this process is evolving, but I believe this is an evolution that's actually been underway for a while, and that is that how government oversees and regulates is, it's a much more interactive process than it was at one time. And I say that to you because there was even work done by the OECD like 25 years ago talking about how to make regulations more effective, and that some of the, like there was a checklist that they put together to determine whether or not regulations were really doing what they were supposed to do, and that checklist did include things like performance-based regulations, and that there should be this economic aspect of the activity should be furthered and advanced. So these are not really new issues. They're things that have come up for us here and now. And we really do see that the role of the private sector has evolved along with how government is overseeing and regulating. Also, the interactions between government agencies the interactions are much more robust, and they're built into the process. And I say that this is a good thing. If there's one word that I would say we all really need to remember on a daily basis as we go through our days, it's listen. We need to listen. We need to work with. So we have an interesting role at the Office of Space Commerce. We're an office in the Department of Commerce, and we coordinate all the different pieces of space within the Department of Commerce, which there are quite a few things that you might not even realize, or you might know, but you don't link it up to the fact that, wow, that's a Department of Commerce activity. For instance, NOAA lives in the Department of Commerce, and that's the largest civil fleet of satellites. We have 18 satellites that we own and operate. We also have NIST, which is the National Institute of Standards and Technology, which also has a role which I will describe a little bit later in my comments. We license commercial remote sensing. So that's another thing that's done by a part of the Department of Commerce, CRISRA, but we interact with CRISMA very often and very substantively. And so there is, right now, we are in the final, the end game, if you will, of adjudicating the substantive, and there were many wonderful comments for the NPRM that we put out a few months ago, and that comment period closed in July. And I will tell you how we are listening. I mean, our department has taken those comments very, very seriously, and we are hoping that that final rule will come out very soon. So, and again, I said that the role of the private sector is evolving along with our role. The private sector has a voice. The private sector is using that voice, and that's a good thing. So another thing that we do is we work on a lot of taskings and directives that flow from Space Policy Directives 2 and 3. And the ones that are in Space Policy Directive 3 are the ones that are most pertinent to the people here. So one of the things that we do is we are working on the transition of the provision of data from the Department of Defense and CSPOC to a civil agency, and we've been working to, we have a person, I'm not going to steal my director's thunder by telling you a whole lot of what he may share with you in tomorrow's keynote, but I will tell you that we are very, very actively involved in a lot of the activities for that transition. We're also very actively involved in an interagency working group that has been working under NASA's leadership to update the U.S. government orbital debris mitigation standard practices. And in fact, some of my colleagues aren't here in this room right now because that call is ongoing. So, and this has been, I'm going to tell you something, there is no groupthink going on. There are all kinds of equities and concerns, and they're very articulately voiced, and it's a process, so we'll see where that ends up. That should finalize relatively soon, we hope. And that's a very interesting thing, because further to what's in Space Policy Directive 3, the role of that those standard practices that come from this government interagency, there's then another tasking that goes to my colleagues at the FAA, the Department of Transportation, and to us to work together and figure out how those standard practices can then become a part of the licensing and the regulations that we have in place, whether they're adequate or not, and if not, yeah, maybe they don't even address something that falls within our purview. But I will tell you also, again, listen. So I'm sure many, if not all of you, are aware of the coalition and the best practices that were made public in the past couple of days. And there too, this is, again, listen. So I think those best practices are a wonderful way for us in government to really get a sense of the appetite that industry has with regard to the kinds of things that they are doing and are wish to continue to do. So we also advocate for industry's interests within the executive branch. So that's a different role than being a regulator. And we have had we've had a lot of industry engagement in the last year's time, and we have the wonderful experience of interacting often with all of these incredibly innovative commercial capabilities, particularly in the SSA and decision-making aid realm. And so we put out an RFI, a request for information, back in April. We received a number of really interesting inputs, all of which also really help us inform the process, but also they tell us what industry needs, what industry wants, so that when we perform our duties in the interagency, we know how best, perhaps, if we can, to advocate for those equities of industry. So I said I would tell you a little bit about what's going on with NIST. I just mentioned that there were some best practices that were made public, but they're not the only ones. And so because we have the standards and technology folks at our NIST campus, and we have a few NIST campuses actually, we asked them to help us compile a landscape review of the existing standards and practices and guidelines that are out there, so that we could perform an analysis, and we're doing this with our colleagues again at the FAA, to glean or to collate out, curate, if you will, which are duplicative, which are, where are the gaps, which might you could combine them and make a better one. And so it's wonderful that now, instead of 41 sets, we have 42. So I will end my remarks there, and again, thank you very much for including government on this panel. Thank you.
Thank you. So I think I want to, a reminder, if you have any questions, please submit them to the app. We've got some already that I'm going to start going through, but please feel free to submit more. Agnieszka, I want to pick up on one thing Diane mentioned, which is the Space Safety Coalition that was announced yesterday, which is a group of operators that are all pledging practices. Planet is one of the members of that. Can you talk a bit about more why you guys felt that was important and what role you see that playing?
Yeah, sure, of course. I mean, I think that, so first of all, Space Safety Coalition, it's an ad hoc group. It's a coalition of the willing, if I may say it like that. It's not a legal body. And it's not about setting up another organization, another bureaucracy. It's about actually doing something. So I think a lot of this, and I don't know if everybody shares that view, but it just came out of a bit of a frustration that we've been talking about a need for setting up norms and best practices and some sort of rules. And we've been talking about it for years, and that's all we've been doing. We've been talking about it. So I think we've reached a point that we don't want to just talk about it. We want to actually do something. So bunch of us got together. Right now there's 18, I believe it's 18 different organizations that signed on to it. They're not only satellite operators. Secure World is actually one of the organizations as well. So there are all kinds of different stakeholders, commercial and government, that actually care about these issues, and they believe that something has to be done. So we got together and we figured that we all have stakes in this, and that we should together start putting some sort of best practices in place and sort of establish some sort of a model of behavior, and hopefully more and more members will join. And this is going to be an organic sort of growth and development where that is just going to be logical and it's just going to make sense. We want to utilize space environment for a long time. There's lots of plans. I mean, SpaceX was just talking about, Dave was just talking about the plans that they have. We have plans. We want to put more assets in space. We want to have different sensors. There are more actors coming coming into this game. So it is really in everybody's interest to take care of this global good and common. So I think the fact that this, I mean, I almost wish that this coalition was set up earlier. I think it takes us, since always, you know, there's too many cooks in the kitchen, takes a while to cook a good meal. But I think we're on the right track. I think that this, hopefully, coalition is going to get traction with more players, not only in the US, but hopefully international operators as well. We can also, as Planet, help with that. We are also established in Europe. We're cooperating with a lot of operators and players in Europe, for instance, but I think this coalition needs to go beyond that, and this is where I would like to see it going.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. So David, you mentioned all the news item about the close approach between a SpaceX, a Starlink satellite, and ESA. And one of the challenges there was just kind of the methods we currently have to do that communication. How do you see that evolving over time? I think I've seen reports that SpaceX is thinking about an automated system for close approaches, but how would you incorporate other satellites in that? So can you talk a little bit about how you're approaching that issue?
Right. So as of last Friday, I checked the data before I came. We had done 21 avoidance maneuvers autonomously with our spacecraft. Of those 21, they were all against non-maneuverable objects. And so the one conjunction that was with the maneuverable, we worked through our bug on. Certainly, one of the things that we are looking to do is in the transparency and data sharing is to publish an interface control document that talks through the timelines of the operations for when burns would occur, and so one of the challenges is some satellites, if they're maneuverable, may have much longer timelines to make a decision for an upload to be able to do their burn. Some, like ours that are more autonomous, might have very short timelines that could be used. And so some sort of automation, I think we see some sort of automation between owner-operators is going to be necessary. Obviously, there's going to be some storming and norming about, okay, who needs to do the, is it the satellite that got there first? Is it the satellite that has the most delta V available, or is it the satellite maybe that can do the burn the latest? Because doing a burn later, obviously you have a much better estimate of the trajectory, and so there will certainly be some automation. It's hard for me to articulate on what that would be. I would be remiss if I didn't recognize the incredible work the 18th Space Control Squadron does, and I think the DO is here, Lieutenant Colonel Maynard, but we all are incredibly grateful for the hard work that they all do every single day, and they probably take a lot of spears, and not a lot of people are patting them on the back all the time, but certainly they shoulder a great responsibility, and we're very grateful for all the work that they do.
So, Mike, we've talked, we've had several panels over the last 5 or 6 years talking about, the emergence of the commercial SSA business. And one question that keeps coming back up is whether or not the existing free government services, is that a challenge you guys see for your business plans, or are you finding ways to work around that and for your products?
Yeah, I think that is a question that comes up a lot, is how we interface with the U.S. government, and whether the fact that there is information and a very valuable service out there from spacetrack.org, whether that erodes some of our business model, and it does. But we have to be out there proving our capabilities and showing that we can do as well and better at tracking objects in low Earth orbit in order to eventually take over some of that mission. And what we would like to do is as we start tracking more and more objects in low Earth orbit, we're tracking about 10,000 objects now, and our goal is to rapidly increase that catalog over the next 2 years, is to take some of that catalog maintenance function off of the shoulders of the 18th and allow us to do some of that, feed that data in, and allow them to do their core mission and focus on their core mission. So I think it's incumbent on us to be out there developing new capabilities, developing better ways to interface with satellite operators and show our value to the SSA market, and build our business that way.
And so, Diane, to follow up on that, Department of Commerce earlier this year had an RFI on what, basically asking industry and kind of the broader community what they could bring to the table in terms of helping improve the way this is done. Can you talk about that a little bit and what sort of responses you got?
I'm going to talk about it a little bit, but I'm not going to talk about it too much because, again, I do believe that Director O'Connell will talk about some of this tomorrow in his remarks. But I want to tell you that LEO Labs is a great example of the kind of commercial capabilities that we want to leverage. They're amazing. They're doing good work, and they're not the only ones. And we want to find a way to certainly, I also am going to tip my hat to the 18th and say, thank you, great job. But we want to find ways to lighten their load and also leverage all of this capability in a way that doesn't supplant one to another, but I don't, again, I'm going to stop myself because tomorrow you will not be disappointed. So know that there were a lot of things came out in the RFI, and in fact it was very interesting because there were even coalitions within the RFI. I think we had one input that was like 9 companies that got together, and that's awesome when you have that much like-mindedness in an input on the commercial capabilities of SSA and STM, that they could actually get together and draft a 20-page input of substance and really give us some direction. That's an amazing thing. And tell us this is what we need. And there's a need for an open architecture data repository. There's a need for better analytics. So again, we advocate for industry, and part of that is getting out of its way or removing impediments wherever they may come from, and finding ways to link up these incredible capabilities with the needs of this community.
Mm-hmm. So, Chris, I'm often in discussions about these topics, and someone will mention, well, insurance is going to solve all this, right? We're just going to make people buy insurance, satellite operators, and they're going to be then incentivized to be responsible. So can you talk about what role insurance can play and what some of the challenges are to work through in that?
Sure, happy to do that. Let me ask a question of the audience. Who in the audience, raise your hand if you do not want a discount on your auto insurance? Yeah, I thought so. So, of course, nobody likes to pay their insurance bill, and I would say the same goes true for satellite operators and others in space. And we do differentiate between types of operators, types of technologies, and so on. And we believe that people who use the available technologies to more than meet the minimum standard deserve recognition. In the past 15 years, space insurance pricing has came down to the point where it was unsustainable and there was no headroom for differentiation. The prices were so low that we were basically unable to differentiate. With these losses this year and last year, we're able to increase prices and we're able to differentiate. So like I said, beacons, propulsion, We're also big advocates of on-orbit inspection. We believe that on-orbit inspection is a very useful tool. In fact, we did a survey of geosatellites launched since 2000, and 50 commercial geosatellites launched since 2000 would have benefited from on-orbit inspection after an anomaly. And there are, I'm sure, at least as many cases of inspection being useful. So we would like to see the government, certainly Diane and her team, make the process of enabling on-orbit inspection easier. In terms of distance, resolution, all that, the whole process, because we think on-orbit inspection is a big, big tool that can be used to make space a safer place. We also want to change the lexicon. You know, when you talk about debris risk, that's, for a satellite operator, that's someone else's problem. A satellite operator isn't making debris. We would rather change the lexicon to collision risk, because collision risk is everyone's problem. So, you know, we have the ability to give that good driver discount. We have the ability to differentiate among operators based on the technologies they use, based on the processes they use. And we would like to see more people try to get that discount. Our feeling, though, is that if we offer a discount for a particular technology or a particular tool that you're using, that's great. But once the world knows that that tool is good, it works, it provides a discount, that really should then become the baseline. And instead of offering a discount for using that, we would prefer to surcharge those who don't use it, to incentivize people to do the right thing. So those are just a few of my comments on that.
So, all right, so easy questions are over. Question for the whole panel. We've been talking about incentives and sort of positive reinforcements, but we haven't really talked a lot about requirements, right? What should satellite operators, large contractors be required to do? And so I'm going to open up to all of you how you want to comment on this, but what do you think should be that balance between, you know, providing incentives and actually having requirements and licensing and rules from governments about you should, must do? Are we at a point where we can make those requirements? Are we still trying to figure out what those are? Can we, you know, trust companies to do the right thing? You know, comments from any of you on that?
Yeah.
Good?
Yeah, I'll start. So I was talking a little bit about the update to the orbital debris mitigation standard practices. Say that really fast. Okay. And I was talking about the fact that there would be follow-on work, and this was contemplated in SPD3. And one of the things was how to make these standard practices relevant to the private sector. So in an awareness that this was going to happen at some point, there would be some finality to this part of this process. My department convened an interagency working group to do just that, to start hashing out what those requirements might be, but not just one agency or office sort of waving the baton and saying this shall be it. It's a process, and it's a process that, like I said before, requires listening. So everybody came to the table, including the FCC, which is an independent administration, and so we all got together and said this is something that we need to do. These are requirements that we need to start to think about and then to discuss. But because we know it's follow-on work, we have to wait for this first part to be finalized, and then we'll pick it up. But we have a charter, and we do have participants. So I think that requirements are something that should come from practices. They should be grounded in the realities of operations. I don't think that they should be abstractions that are imposed, but I think that they should be organic, much like what Agnieszka was describing earlier.
Yeah. Chris, and then.
Yeah, I think it's important to implement requirements now. The regulation word, the R word, is a bad word among entrepreneurial space, but I think it's better to put in place those requirements now, and we understand them, we have time to make sure they're right, because when that inevitable collision happens and we're sitting in front of a congressional committee with some very angry Congress people imposing on us some very strict requirements, that's when we want to be able to say, no, we actually already have a regime in place. So I think it's very important to get that straight now.
Basically avoiding the Facebook problem, right?
Yes, exactly.
Amen.
Yeah. So this is an interesting question because as it was said, I mean, after commercial sector, doesn't want to be regulated and doesn't want more regulation. But there's certain common sense in this, and there's certain logic in it. And then, and it's like I said, it's in everybody's interest. So certain requirements, I think, are inevitable. And what I really like what Diane said, that we are kind of in a place where we can all discuss this together. A few years ago, I don't know, 10 years ago, and maybe even 5 years ago, like industry would not be at that table.
No, it's changed.
And that has changed, and I think this is a very positive change, that we can actually talk about what we feel makes sense, what we are comfortable with. But I think, Brian, you taught me this phrase, the tragedy of the commons. I think I've learned that from you, and I actually used that a lot in my PhD dissertation.
I
You
didn't
quoted
invent it.
all
I
of
sort
it.
of-
I know, but you introduced me to it. And as David said, I mean, it's space operations, a team sport. So we cannot just, the debris that I'm going to cause can also harm me. So I can be shooting myself here in the foot if I don't participate. What I am worried about, though, and what I would like, and I don't actually know how to go about that, but I think when we're talking about requirements, they really need to be international, because again, we're talking about this global space where there are all kinds of different players, and they can all cause a lot of mess. So it's not, I think we don't want to put, for instance, ourselves in disadvantage, putting some strict requirements where others are just, doing whatever they want. So I think that's, for this to work, it would have to be really on the international level.
Mike?
Yeah, so of course, in many ways, we already have requirements. So for example, around collision avoidance, we already have collision risk, acceptable orbital lifetime collision risk. So there's the requirement aspect, but another big aspect is compliance. So making sure that those orbital risks, say that we're licensing, are actually the orbital risks of the objects, or the orbital plans going to specific altitudes or specific mission scenarios, that those are actually implemented. So there's one aspect which is putting on reasonable, say, requirements around lifetime collision risk, but then there's another about ensuring that operators are complying with those limits and taking appropriate action to limit collision risk.
Yeah, I think for me, having been in the government, when I was in the government, I loved requirements. Now, not so much.
Somewhere in the middle.
In the government, I didn't really care how the requirements are written, and now I am like looking at every little, every letter in the way that they're written. So I think, for me, we would want to be able to participate significantly in any of the development and have a very consensus-based approach. And the other thing is, it's very, very important how they're written, right? They need to be written in a way to give owner-operators the flexibility to meet them using innovative methods, as opposed to thou shalt put a GNSS receiver on your satellite for tracking, right? There needs to be flexibility for owner-operators to be able to implement and use innovation to solve these problems.
Mm-hmm. So, question for you. You mentioned that the original plan for Starlink was up at a much higher altitude, and you guys have moved part of it down. Can you talk through sort of the decision calculus and why that was made? Because part of the trade-off is, at a higher altitude, there's much less stuff, so it's kind of just you guys, but it's a longer debris time. But so anyways, talk about that.
So you told me that I couldn't use charts, so I have a perfect chart to show you that really that shows sort of the sweet spot for us when we looked at all the debris and what altitudes they were in, debris from the several collisions that have occurred, and where everyone's operating, and then the natural decay that you get. We sort of optimized down lower in those altitudes. It is challenging with respect to having the International Space Station there, because we obviously know that it's a priority for all of us to protect the space station. And so if we do end up, we could end up wanting to operate even below the space station in the future as we look at the trades and our ability to be able to launch the number of satellites that we want to launch. But we'll see where those trades go.
Another question that came in from the audience is whether satellites without maneuver capability should be allowed to be in LEO or above the space station. I know that's something that we've been talking about for a while, and you guys at Planet have been thinking about that because you're a large concept without dedicated maneuver capability. Is that something either that the governments are thinking about requiring, or on the operator side, how you've been dealing with that at all?
I think we're thinking about everything.
I have notes on this. I'm checking on this because I actually asked about that because I knew this was going to be asked. So our doves, first of all, our doves, so we have three types of constellations. Doves are CubeSats, 3U, that are passive. They're in sun-synchronous orbit, and they are, there's about 150 of them or so. That changes, but they are passive. That doesn't mean that we cannot, so they do not have propulsion, but that doesn't mean that there are not ways for them to maneuver. And this is what I was talking, those are my notes that I got because I am a policy person, not a technical person. But we can do ducking maneuvers to reduce the interaction cross-section and therefore reduce POC. We do this automatically already. So this is something that we do now. With other satellites, so we have also rapid eye satellites, 5 of them, and then we have 15 SkySat satellites. Those are taskable, and obviously we can maneuver those. But what is at least helpful with passive satellites that we have, that they always know where they are, right? We're not going to move them into somewhere that, I mean, the prediction there, it's pretty stable.
Mm-hmm. So last question I have for the group as a whole, and this gets to basically this question about best practices and standards. You guys are doing some things that really haven't been done before, right? We have never seen a constellation of 1,000 satellites. You guys were the first, big multi-U or small U CubeSat constellation, which again, there's a lot of concerns about that. Diane, you've mentioned we want to base our licensing and regulations on best practices and standards. So how do we enable the practices to get to that point, right? But that also means letting people go fly satellites and potentially make mistakes, and which could lead to challenges. So thoughts on how to unpack that paradox a little bit?
Well, I think you deal with that in confers, if I'm not mistaken.
We do.
Because
We try.
we're talking about putting together standards for activities that are not, what's the practice? We're not practicing, we're thinking about practicing. So I think, it's helpful in that kind of an inquiry to figure out what is your goal, what is it that you want to avoid, what is it that you want to achieve, and then kind of reverse engineer it a bit from there. Without getting, and I think by looking at it from that standpoint, you don't get so onerous because you're kind of continuing to perform activities. I think it's difficult. I think, we've seen it in the launch industry with permits, and so there's ways that you can oversee activities and do some sort of vetting, but not make it as onerous so that you allow the innovations to flourish. And I think that we have to kind of look at that kind of model and a lot of the other, the newer uses of things that we've had satellites for a number of years, but we have new uses and we're communicating with them differently and we want to do different things with them. We're putting them in different places, more of them. So I think that requires that we, kind of take a step back. We actually have a lot of lessons learned, and a lot of the things that we've learned apply in these particular contexts. I mean, the physics are the physics, and I think that we determine what our goals are, and then we kind of build the practices out from that.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, so I think a lot of the new licensing language out of the proposed language from the FCC and also some of the Department of Commerce work, is trying to enable the ability to test in space by, say, putting small satellites at lower altitudes and relaxing licensing requirements for those. And you could imagine something similar for test satellites in the larger constellations. And I think that's great, and we should applaud that. But I do think that it has to go beyond that we have to, while we're in these test phases, be constantly evaluating how the technology is working and whether it makes sense to license these satellites to go, to a constellation or go to higher altitudes. And to do that, we need the data and tools to continuously monitor and assess compliance with them.
Any other comments? All right. Please join me in thanking my panelists for this morning's discussion.
It's an ecosystem, and you're right.